Tell you what, I hope you all realize how spoiled we are to have, Torrance and his band week after week lead. Man, that's good stuff. I am not a good singer, but I very much love to sing, and oftentimes in weeks I have to be the one to, or I get to be the one, I should say, to prepare the message to deliver it. I have to remind myself, sing a little bit less right now and save your voice. And during that second song, I could feel my voice cracking. They said, Michael, you better back it down. You're not going to have a voice here in a second. Had to go get some water and try to oil those vocal cords a little bit. But man, we are so spoiled. And man, if I can just let you in on my conviction a little bit, this is not the message at all, but during that second song when we sang, God, you are my everything, to myself I stopped and said, Lord, you're not my everything, but I want you to be my everything. And I think you've got to just create space to allow the Lord to convict. And sometimes it's during the sermon, but I think sometimes it's while you were in the middle of that worship. And, I was on vacation with the family last week, spring break, and man, how important it is that you don't miss church. I mean, just being out 1 week of just vacation with the family, and so it's 14 days without church, it hurts my heart a little bit. And I need that constant reminder and constant on it. The Lord's asked us to be for him to be our daily bread. And I think just church once a week or once a month or just so often is not enough, that we need to keep renewing that to be a daily bread, that we need him week in, week out, day in, day out. Again, that's not part of the message, just letting you in on a little bit of my conviction there, so there's that. I am going to tell you two stories today. They are very much unrelated, but I think if you'll stick with me, I can tie the two of them together. One, of course, is in the Bible. We'll talk about the Babylonian children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with Daniel. How many have heard those names before? If you heard those names, good. Many people have been to church. You've heard that before. Then I'm going to give you I'm going to retell a story that I heard. When I first heard this story, I was 5 years old. And it was a good enough story that I still very much remember it. Now, I heard this man tell the story again at a later time, and so I've been refreshed over the years, but it had such an impact on me as a 5-year-old boy that it made me want to preach the gospel with my life. I wanted to do that. That's how much that meant. And so, by the way, a small plug for kids' church, that your 4 and 5 and 6-year-old children can get a seed planted in them that they can still be serving the Lord and professing their faith decades and decades later. So don't think it's not important to get your kids into church, because it very, very much is. So I think if you were here 2 weeks ago, they made some announcements that we've kind of restructured some structure within the church here. And I had some fancy operations title that I'm moving out of, and I'm moving into the next generation pastor. And so we're going to kind of oversee everywhere from your little kids in the nursery all the way up until they graduate from high school, maybe a little bit beyond that even. And then my wife, Kendra, who's down with them today, she's still getting used to Pastor Kendra. I don't know if she's on board with it yet, but I'm working on it a little bit. She likes Miss Kendra. If you don't know, my wife runs a daycare, so she is Miss Kendra all day, every day. And so converting to Pastor Kendra doesn't sound right to her yet, but I'm working on her. But she's our new kids pastor, and let me tell you, I'm not just saying this because she's my wife. She's not here today. She is here. She's down there with the children. She won't hear me say this. You don't know what you're getting and how awesome that lady is. She was just, if anybody was ever doing what they were designed to be doing, it is her. She has 5 children. We share those 5 children, by the way. I would be in trouble if I just said that. Whew, those are our children. Man, that was a close one. And still yet somehow that's not enough, and she goes to work and watches other people's children all day, every day, and just loves it. There was one day about 3 years ago, she had a couple girls call off on the same day, and she was stressing in the morning, and I said, you know what, I got to say, let me call off, I'll help you. And so I did the longest day of my life. The longest day of my life. I remember going home just exhausted and just drained and just had nothing left. And it was like, gee, how do you do this? And she was like, today's a light day, just so you know. And so it just reaffirmed that, man, make sure you're doing what God's called you to do. Because when you're in that space, if you go to that next steps with Pastor Keith and he helps you find you do what you want to do, it almost seems effortless. And you start doing the thing that you weren't designed to do. It works, but man, it's a lot more work. And so I'm going to challenge you today as part of the message to kind of find that purpose, but I will also be very much unashamedly selling you on kids ministry today. I have a goal of recruits I'm trying to get today, just so you know, if you feel that calling, that is by design. And I am working on you to get more help down in there, but you are going to I think you're just going to see that your kids are just going to be just transformed, and we have a big vision for them. I'm just really excited to tell it. But with that kind of starts off with the story that I heard this man tell. This man's name was Jack, and he was kind of telling his own story of what led him to be the pastor of the church that I was going to. And he talked about how he grew up in a really poor town in a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas. Really poor town with just his mother and his sister. His father, he had known just from a very young age, had left the home because he had a really difficult alcohol abuse problem. And it became just a real issue where he began to put his hands on his mother and himself, and to a point where it just led where dad just couldn't be part of the home anymore. And so he left, and so that just led Jack, or his friends would call him, and his mom would call him Jackie Boy. She had to raise Jackie Boy on her own with another child, and that led them going to a different church than what they had grown up with. And so when they moved to this church in the small part of town, they had to walk to church. Of course, they didn't have a vehicle. And when they walked to church, they realized right away, and remember Jack told the story, that he felt he was out of place because, in his words, this was a rich church, and he was a poor little boy. And he could just tell right away, like, he didn't fit right. And it was a big church, and they plugged him into a class, and he could just tell, like, he said he kept seeing, like, all the fancy shoes. He said he was 5 years old at the time, the same age I was when I heard him tell this story. He said he just remember seeing all these shiny shoes, and he sat down cross-legged, and he was kind of looking around, not sure, and he kind of peeked at the bottom of his shoes, and there was a hole in his shoe, and there was a hole right through his sock to where he could see his bare foot through his crossed leg. And he looked over at his other foot, and he could see a hole through his shoe and sock just the same. And here he was with kind of hiding his feet, and he's looking around all these little shiny shoes. He said he very much looked down, remembering and seeing one little kid's shoe that was this nice patent leather shoe and had a nice polished little copper penny in the loaf of it. It was one of those penny loafers. And he said he just remember thinking it was so nice and that he didn't belong where he was at. And he was just sitting there, and nobody was making fun of him, anything like that. He just felt like out of place. He could just tell he didn't really belong. And some lady came over to him and knelt down by him, and he said he described her as a really old lady. And he said later he realized she was not really old, just in his mind, that's how he pictured her. And she said, "Hi, my name is Miss Bethel. Can I hold you for a minute, Jack?" And he goes, "Yeah." She goes, "Everybody call you Jack?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "But well, my mom calls me Jackie Boy." "Okay, that's great." She picked him up. She goes, "Can I tell you a story?" He goes, "Sure." And she read him through a wordless story or a pictureless story. If you're familiar at all, it's something that we do sometimes with the kids where there's nothing but colors on a page. And every color represents something different. Like black would be the sin in your heart, and the white would be your salvation, and the red would be the blood of Jesus, would be crimson, and then the yellow would be for the people who were scared to tell about Jesus. And she read him through the story, and she said, "I just want you to know, Jackie, that God loves you." And he goes, "Yes, I know." He goes, "Can I ask you a question, Miss Bethel?" And she goes, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "Does God love me as much as the kids without holes in their shoes?" And she said, "Jackie, I want you to look at me." She said, "I don't think God loves you like he loves you, those kids. I think he loves you more." And Jack says at that age, he goes, "I remembered thinking, I want to serve a Lord who's going to love me as much as the kids with the poor shoes. As much as the kids that have the fancy shoes, that loves me that same way." I remember it's like as a 5-year-old, tears just running down my face and just thinking like that was so powerful a thing, and I did not have holes in my shoe, but the fact that they could relate those two together. Well, Jackson went on, he ended up going in college, he ended up going to school and excelled in school. Did really, really well. He was a really smart kid, and he ended up growing up to be where he had all these different scholarship offers. But later on in his life, his father tried to re-enter his life, and he had gotten his act cleaned up a little bit and had gone into business and had done really well for himself. And Jack would say it had kind of bothered him that he had done so well for himself and had let him and his mom and his sister grow up so poor, but he was very much craving that male attention, so he agreed to meet his dad on a few occasions. They met and they began to grow a little bit of a relationship. And through this, he had learned his dad had built a fairly successful business and was looking to branch out and build his business. And he had found that his son, Jack, that he had abandoned as a 5-year-old, was really intelligent and really going somewhere in life, and said, "Hey, why don't you come work for me?" And so Jack would say, "Man, I was challenged. I thought, man, I might like to do that." But the only problem is Jack had just several years earlier surrendered to be a preacher with his life. And he was already weighing, should I be a preacher, go to seminary, Baptist Bible college, or should I go to the secular college and get my degree in business? He was already weighing that. Now he had this third option, going to business with my dad. He was weighing all these, but in his heart kind of knew he should be a preacher. And one day his dad met him and said, "Hey, I got to get a decision. I got to get this line. I got to hire you or somebody else. I got to know." And he goes, "You got 1 week to make your decision." He goes, "Okay, that's fine, 1 week." And so they agreed they would meet on this one intersection in Dallas, Texas. And they were going to meet a week later. Back pre-cell phone, you had to plan these things. I know it's odd that you'd plan the exact date and street corner you'd meet on, but when you didn't have a phone, you had to do those things. By the way, have phones not taken our ability to plan? That's a side note. I could go off on that, but we won't. We got to clap. All right, there we go. So they had agreed to meet. Let me stop there, and I'll come back to this here towards the end of the lesson. I'm going to how that kind of went. Now, if I can radically shift gears, if you can all stick with me, okay? We're going to come back to Jack meeting with his dad on a street corner, and we're going to jump into a Bible story here. This takes place originally in Daniel 1. We're going to spend most of our time in Daniel 3, and we're going to get back to Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we talked about. And to kind of set the scene, if you're not familiar with how they all left here, is the Israelites, God-chosen people, they lived in Israel. They were conquered by Babylon. Babylon is in what's in modern-day Iraq. So they were the largest army and land people of the day. They came over and they just desolated the Israeli army and the Israeli forces. They just tore everything, burned it to the ground, broke their gates down, just really desolated it. There was not much left of it. But with it, so many of the warriors died off, and they kept some, but it was just awful. They destroyed everything. But what they did is they tried to keep a few of the best and the brightest, so to speak, of the young people of the land and try to bring them back from Israel to Babylon to use that for their need and for their benefit. That's how it was. And so they took a whole group of people. And the best we can tell that this group of people was somewhere between the ages of 13 and high end, maybe like 21. These were kids that they took, that they recognized that they were sharper than just everybody else. They said, hey, we're going to bring you with you, and we're going to put you in our schools and our fancy schools and our secular schools. We're going to raise you up, and eventually maybe someday you can be in charge of different things because we're going to take your best, and everyone's not. We're just going to leave you in that desolate land. We're not worried about you because we've taken your best and killed all your warriors. And so they were threatless to the Babylonians. So they did that. They bring them in, and right away, these particular people started making huge waves in the Babylonian Empire. Specifically, we see in Daniel 1 where they sit and they start eating, they sit at the table of the king, that they're recognized, that they're really important. And the king, they sets it up there, and they start to eat the meat and the wine the king has. But the problem is, this is BC, the days of before Christ, and so the Hebrew children, the Israelites, had their own little callings, convictions, and purposes that they had to keep separate, that they wouldn't eat certain things. For example, they didn't eat pork, they didn't drink wine, they didn't do any of these certain things that kept them aside. But the king, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, said, no, I want you to eat my meat. I want you to drink my wine. I want you to do these things. And by the way, let me tell you, as just a small side note here, when you become a Christian, there are certain things that the Lord will tell you that you don't put in your body anymore. There's certain places you don't go anymore. There's certain things you don't say anymore. And what that is to individual people may not be to me, but it is to you. And some of you know those things, and ask yourself, if you've gotten to know Christ later in life, what is different about your life now than your life before? Do you still go to all the same places you went before you met Jesus? Do you still say all the same things you say before you met Jesus? Do you still put the same things in your body before you met Jesus you do now? Because something should be different. There should be something a little bit different from you than your coworker who does not know Jesus. If you invite someone to church this week for Easter, I would love that, and they say, oh, wow, I didn't know you go to church, then you might be doing something wrong. And by the way, I want you to invite your neighbors and your coworkers to church. I've been working on some of mine. And by the way, mine very much know that I go to church, and they don't understand it. I brought my Bible to work on accident one day, literally on accident. In fact, it was the Monday morning after I preached, and I set it on my little desk there, and it was amazing how uncomfortable people got with a Bible sitting on my desk. They thought I was making some kind of statement. Really, I was just making space for things to go in, and that's all that side note. But there should be something a little bit different in your life. But so Nebuchadnezzar challenged them to eat the meat, and the Bible says in chapter 1 there, it says, forgive me as I scroll back it says when you, forgive me here, I'm going to go all the way back to chapter 1. Do we have that on the screen? The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and the wine that he drank. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Daniel resolved. How many in your life that you have to make a resolution? I know there's things that I've said in my life, I'm not going to say this, I'm not going to drink this, I'm not going to eat this, I'm not going to go here, that you have to resolve that in your heart, or you will one day eat and do and say and go and do all those things you said you wouldn't want to do. There has to be a resolution. I have 4 points with you today. That first one here is zeal is a passion for purpose. Zeal is a passion for purpose. We've mentioned it before. In fact, Pastor Keith talks about it a lot. Some of the greatest days in life, the days you're born, the days you find out what you were born to do. I think sometimes that passion comes first before you find out what that calling is. As a 5-year-old boy, God planted a passion for purpose within my heart that I had no idea what my calling would eventually be. I assumed as a 5-year-old boy, I would one day be standing at his spot preaching the gospel as a pastor of a church, pastor of a very large church indeed. I assumed that would be my lot. That has never been my lot. because God had not yet called me for that, but He had given me a passion for purpose, a zeal from within, that I was resolved that because I was going to be used of God someday in my life, I knew as a small child there were things I couldn't do, there were people I couldn't be friends with, that there were places I couldn't go, there were things I couldn't say, that I had to be set apart, that I had to have a passion for my purpose that I would one day find out. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, very much as we find out, had a passion for the Lord. I'm sure when they built that passion was planted within them. They did not see themselves one day sitting at a king's table, not serving the God they wanted to in the fashion of which they wanted to. I'm sure they thought they would be growing up preaching the gospel, selling the gospel of Jesus in their land of Israel, but yet God had planted them in a foreign nation. He had allowed them to be conquered by a wicked nation. But they had a passion for purpose that translated to eventually they would get point number 2, a conviction for their calling. I think this is very much a personal thing. There are things the Bible tells us, hey, this is a sin, this is not a sin, this is right, this is wrong, and we'll get to those things here in a minute. But there are convictions beyond that. I hesitate saying this, and I hope that you'll give me a little bit of grace when I say this, but I felt like as a child, through a sermon I had heard, that God had told me that alcohol should not touch my lips. I don't think it's a sin to drink alcohol. But I remember as like a 14-year-old boy in a camp setting, challenged by a pastor saying, I will never drink alcohol. So here I am in my mid-40s standing here today, and alcohol has never touched my lips. That is a conviction the Lord gave me beyond that. But I think it started when I had a passion for that present. And when that passion eventually grew into the Lord gave me a conviction for my calling. I yet didn't know what my purpose was, but I had that conviction that I had in my heart. Am I here trying to get you today to make that decision? No, I'm not. Maybe some of you think that that's something you should do, and great if that's what the Lord tells you. But that was my conviction that I had a passion for. I don't know if there was anything sinful with Daniel eating the king's meat or drinking the king's wine. He just knew he had a conviction in his heart that he had resolved, I will not do that. And I believe with all my heart, had Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, you know what, we're not in Israel anymore. We don't have to observe the Hebrew law. The Hebrew law is gone. It's desolated. It lies in rubble in Israel. We could probably just adapt, and we could still serve our God, and we could give up these convictions. There has been many a table, many a party as a teenager even, where alcohol rose through, but yet I had resolved in my heart that the Lord did not want me to have that. But I had resolved it, and I don't think, by the way, if I would be here standing today had I given up on that resolution I had made that the Lord gave me as a 14-year-old boy. And again, I'm not telling you what that is. Some of you, your callings are different. I know some of you. Some of you are called to work with children. Some of you are called to work with teenagers. Some of you are called to a life of prayer. Some of you are called to a life of service. Some of you are called to a life of giving. Whatever that conviction you have, that you have to resolve in your heart, I will not defile this conviction. You have to have a calling to that conviction. We'll keep moving here. Number 3, zeal is steadfast in strength. This is where we get to specifically these 3 gentlemen, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And see, those were not their original names. Their original names were Daniel, as I mentioned, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we'll get to this as we wrap it up as we get to the end. But the Babylonians took them into captivity, and immediately changed their names to other names. And that's the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego we get today. And by the way, if you know a better pronunciation of that, just keep it to yourself. I'll say it how I want to say it right now. So that's how I learned these as a child. And so I'm aware that one of those is off, and we're just going to keep saying it, and you're going to like it. So there's that. But we're going to read a few verses here. Before we get to it, let me kind of set the scene a little bit. Is early on in this captivity, these children are all here, and the king, Nebuchadnezzar, which is the most powerful man in the land, decides that he wants to build this giant statue of himself, which he does, and it's like ridiculously tall. It's made of all these different precious metals that I'm not going to get into today. And then to go deeper with it, he says, all right, and we're going to do this. So this big giant statue I have of myself, which who builds a statue of themselves? That kind of tells you a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar. And he just says, then we're going to do this thing where every so often we're going to play music. And all these fancy instruments, all these harps, the lyres, the instruments, the drums, the horns, they're all going to play at the same time. And when no matter where you're at, what you're doing, when these noises and all these instruments play, you're going to stop what you're doing, drop to your knees, and you're going to bow down and worship my idol. Essentially, you're going to worship me. Well, there's a conversation there that I'm not going to get into today where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah say, yeah, we're not doing that. We're not bowing down to some guy because he's a king, because he has power, because he has money. We serve the one true God. We're not doing that. Like, we're not doing that. And the music's going to play, and we don't know what it's going to be, but we're not doing that. And so eventually one day that happens. The music plays and all the horns and the sounds and the lyres and the drums and all the music goes off, and I imagine it that you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people stop what they're doing and they drop to their knees and they bow down and they worship this statue. Well, we know that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah do not bow the knee. They stand strong, and they say, no, we don't do that. Well, the Bible says this infuriates Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, oh my, he brings them in. He says, hey, what are we doing that we're not doing this? What is this true? And they were very much, yeah, that's true. And he says, why is that? And they tell him, yeah, we don't have to answer you on that. Literally, it's what they tell him. We don't have to give you an answer on that. Well, why wouldn't you bow down? Yeah, we don't have to answer you on that. And I have learned sometimes when you have your conviction, you don't owe anybody else an explanation. You know how many times I've been asked, like, oh, why don't you drink? Yeah, I don't. Or I'll have people that question it, right? I'll tell them, oh, I've actually never drank in my life. And they'll say, ever? It's like, what kind of a jerk would I be to say, well, okay, ever, not never, but ever. Yeah, you got me with the semantics there. And then they'll say, but not once? And it's like, well, that's what never means, right? So never, not once, not like your wedding or here. It was like, never. Like, how else could you misinterpret the word never? Like, that's just it. I've never done it. And then they'll immediately go to, oh, so you had a problem with it and you kind of came out of it. And it's like, sure, if that's what you want to go with, fine. I don't drink. And people so desperately want an explanation of that, and they want to know, and it's just like, yeah, it's a conviction I have. I don't drink. Oh, because your religion? No. I'm not part of a religion. I'm just a Christian. And that really bothers people. They can't. Just like the children of Israel said, we don't have to give you an explanation, King. Don't feel like you have to always give an explanation of your calling and your conviction, because, by the way, the world won't understand it. So sometimes there's the proverb would say, don't cast your pearls before swine. And sometimes you have your nicest jewels or your most precious to you. Don't feel like you have to slop them down in the mud with the pigs. You can keep those convictions to you, and you don't always have to explain those to other people. But zeal is steadfast and strength. So what happens is they go before the king, and he says, why? They said, we don't explain it to you. And it makes him so mad, he says, that's it. I'm giving you all the death penalty. And he had what they call the fiery furnace, which the best we can tell was probably some very large, maybe 20, 30-foot circumference around brick furnace of some kind. They would create fire in there. It would be incredibly hot, where sometimes they would cook meals in it, but oftentimes this was used as an execution chamber. They would put people in and they would die, and that's what the king demanded. So that's it. Since you will not bow to me, you're getting thrown into this furnace. I'm throwing you in, and it's going to be a death penalty. He says, in fact, turn it up 7 times hotter. I don't know how hot it was originally, but 7 times seems like a lot hotter. And so he orders his guards, and they bind them up, and they tie them up, and they get Shadrach, and they drag them in, and they throw them into the furnace. And the Bible says the furnace was so hot that the men that threw them in, the guards, were killed by the heat of the fire. And that's where the steadfast and the strength comes in. A lot of people say, oh, I'm not bowing. And it's like, well, if you don't bow the knee, death penalty. I think sometimes a lot of us then, we start wavering on our calling and our conviction. Now, no one has ever tempted me with that. Drink or you're going to the fiery furnace. That has not been something I've dealt with in my life. But I'd like to think I would be resolved for that calling, for that conviction for my calling, that I would not do such a thing. I know as a kid, we had a pastor once would be like, what would you do if somebody put a gun to your head so you believe in God or not? And it would be like, wow, that's a little heavy-handed. But there are people around the nation around the world that get put in that scenario every day and are asked to denounce their faith in the Lord, or they lose their life. Now that's heavy. Just as I told you earlier, I was convicted. I don't know if God is my everything. I want him to be. And I don't know if it's a choice between death or life that I would choose the Lord, but I'd like to think I would. Because that calling and conviction I made, and my passion for purpose and my steadfast strength. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, is they had that steadfast strength. They said, we're not going to defy ourselves. We're not going to bow the knee. We don't care what the penalty is. And they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And the Bible said the king he dealt with his wrath. He was angry, and after a little time went away, and he slept on it. He thought about it. He wanted to go see, and the children of Israel, Shadrach, Meshach, told him, you can throw us in, but we think our God's going to protect us. But even if he doesn't, we're ready to go in. And those words stuck with him. And the Bible says he went back, and the next day he kind of looked in, and he said he called to his guards and was like, hang on a second. Didn't we throw 3 people in here? we threw 3 in here, right? And they're like, yeah, we definitely threw 3. And he says, well, that's strange because I see 4 people. And the 4th is as like the Son of God. And let me tell you, sometimes having a steadfast strength doesn't mean you don't go into the fiery furnace. What that means is God goes in the fiery furnace with you. Like, I think sometimes you've been sold a bill of goods by maybe a pastor you might hear on TV or something like that it's all like get saved and your life just changes and everything is get better, accept Christ in your heart, and everything's just roses and no more raindrops. How many of you can attest that has not been the case since you met Jesus? I have not had a fiery furnace in my life, but I have had hard times. And let me tell you, you don't avoid the hard times, but the Lord is there with you in those hard times. It's not the story today, but we find Daniel, the 4th member of this quartet, that gets thrown into a den of lions later on. And the Bible says the lions were hungry and they were starving and hadn't eaten for days potentially. And he survives that because the Lord shuts their mouth. Like Daniel had to go into the den of lions. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to go into the furnace of fire. They had to deal with that. They had to deal with that pain likely, that fear, that angst, that anxiety. But the Lord was with them. But first, they had to stand strong in their trial. I think sometimes we have not seen God with us in our trial because we have not stood strong in our trial. We may have full bowed the knee to the enemy, but we might have just crouched down a little bit so we didn't stand out. I've been there. I would like to say I haven't, but I've been there. I've been at times where I knew I probably should have ducked out, or probably should have raised my hand, or probably should have not been somewhere, and you just kind of blend in with the crowd. I was joking today with Pastor Torrance. We were setting up that there's a man that's a comedian, that's a Christian, that he jokes about. He'll play song lyrics, and you have to guess if the song was written to God or to their boyfriend. And some of these Christian songs are so intermixed that it's funny, but it's also almost a little not funny. Because sometimes we're drawn to a song that it's about God if you read between the lines, but it doesn't mention God. It doesn't mention Jesus. And you could just take Jesus out and plug a boyfriend in, and it could be the same thing. Because we try to sometimes camouflage God in our lives. It's like, I don't mind being a Christian. I don't mind going to church, but I don't want everybody to know I'm a Christian. And we may not bow, but we just crouch down a little bit. The music's playing, and so we just lower our head a little bit. And we don't see God in our trials because we don't have that steadfast strength to stand up and be like, yeah, I'm a Christian, what of it? And if I go to the fiery furnace, if I go to the fiery water, if I go to the den of lions, so be it, God will protect me. But if not, I'm still doing what I know is right. Pretty powerful stuff. The last point we had mentioned here, if I can run through them again. Zeal is a passion for purpose. It's a conviction in your calling. Zeal is a steadfast strength. It's also a trust in your true identity. There was a study I had seen, this is probably 25 years old or so, where they took these 10 different kids and they were trying to do a study on peer pressure. And they took them in a room, and they'd sit in a small little room with maybe 10, 15 chairs, and there would be nothing but a screen in front of them, and they would flash a single light on the screen, a color of a light, for example, green. And then somebody would come over the audio and say, what color is the light? And they'd say, oh, it's green. Okay. And they'd change and put up a red color and they'd say, what color is the light? And they'd say, oh, it's red. And they would do this over and over and over. Well, then they would send somebody else in the room with them, and they would flash the same red light. They would say, what color is this light? And before the person that was part of the study got a chance to answer, the person that was included in the study that person didn't know would say, green, that light's green, even though the light was clearly red. And they would watch as that person would look and be like, well, what do you think the color is? It's green, it's green. They'd be like, well, I think it's red. Okay, do another one. They'd put another light up, there'd be a yellow light, and the person that was in on the study would say the wrong color. Oh, that's a blue light. And within 4 or 5 times, the person would eventually start mimicking the person next to them. They would start saying like, yeah, that's a blue light, even though they knew it was red. Or they would say it was a green light and they knew it was green. They would just start changing the colors. And some people, it took them a second or a third person in the room before they'd all agree. And they had 10 kids. They put them in one after another. And they'd all get the color right. Oh, that's a red light. That's a green light. But once they had a second or third person in the room with them, they'd all start agreeing that this color was the wrong color. And they got to the last kid, who was the 10th and final kid, and they gave him all the lights. It was red, that's red, it's green. And they sent the person in, and they changed the colors up on him again. They flashed the red light, and the person said, that's a green light. And this lady, no, it's not. That light's red. He goes, no, it's green. Nope, it's red. She stuck with it. And they sent a second person in the room with them, and they flashed the same red light up. She said, what color is this light? And both people said, it's green. And this girl said, nope, that's a red light. I don't know what you guys are talking about, but that light is red. I am not crazy. They send a third person in the room. They flash a different light up there. Put up the light up there. They put that red light again, and green, green, green. The girl, nope, that light is red. I don't know what you're talking about. And they stack the room, and eventually the girl would get mad and be like, what are you talking about? The light is red. We all know the light is red. Why can't you see this? In fact, she started looking from their angles and was like, the light is red. The light is red. And as simple as that sounds, we all have things in our life. We've been trained our whole lives that this light is red, that what we know to be right is right, and what we know to be wrong is wrong. But what's happened is we've had a coworker or a family member or a friend enter the room with us and say, nope, I think that's right. We know it's wrong. We know with all of our heart that's wrong. We know that's wrong, but yet we'll say it's right because the person next to us says it's right. And what we have to do is have that resolve, that trust, that focus, that when the whole world tells me the light's green, I'm going to know the light's red. When the whole world tells me that's wrong, when my friends and my family, everybody says the light's green, I want to stand up and say, no, that light is red because the Bible says it's red, and I don't care what anybody else says or whatever else the consequence means for me, the light is red. That's what we need. That last point is trust in your true identity. We had mentioned earlier that they brought these kids in and they changed their names. So we can go to that slide. In fact, we can rush towards the end. Is they changed Daniel's name to Belshazzar. Hananiah, they changed to Shadrach. Mishael to Meshach, Azariah, and Abednego. And this is important because if we can forward through these slides a little bit, because their names had powerful meanings. Daniel meant God is my judge. Hananiah, Yah, God's name, has been gracious. Mishael is who is what God is. Azariah, Yah has helped me. And they changed their names to mean Belshazzar. Bel, their God they serve, will protect us. They changed up Hananiah to Shadrach, means inspired by Aku. Aku was the moon god of the day. Mishael, who is what God is, they changed to Meshach, belongs to Aku. And last, Azariah, they changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nagu, another god they served. You see, the world wants to change our names. They want to change our identities. You notice some of these are just the slightest difference. When they changed Mishael to Meshach, he went from belonging, or what is God, to belong to Aku. In fact, you could argue those were the same thing potentially, belonging to God, belonging to Aku. And you have to have that calling, that power in your conviction, that steadfast strength to know your identity, or the world will try to change you just a little bit. You know how many times in my life I've been challenged, hey, one drink's not going to hurt anything. Oh, one little word's not going to say anything. One little television show that you know you shouldn't watch, it won't mean anything. It's so close. One little place you can go that you probably shouldn't go that the Lord convicted in you. One little thing, but that one little thing changes everything. The world wants to change your name. They want to give you an identity, anything other than Christ. Today I'm telling you, I am a Christian. And the world would love me for to be anything but a Christian, a follower of Christ. When people at work look at me, I want them to say, oh, Michael the Christian, not Michael the AC guy. I think the world would be happy if I was Michael the AC guy. I think devil would be fine with that. I don't think he needs me to be Michael the devil worshiper. He'd be fine if I just tweaked it up just a little bit. You have a name. You are a child of God. I told you I'd wrap up with Jack standing on that street corner in Dallas, Texas, and he met up a week later with his father. And he told his dad, I want to go into business with you, but I can't because the Lord's called me and I'm going to be a preacher. And his dad got so angry, they began to yell at him, began to push him. And he backed him up, kept pushing him. Eventually, Jack fell on his back and his dad stood over top of him. And he just began to yell and cuss and scream at him and said, if you're going to go pastor a church, why don't you just go pastor the biggest church in the whole world? And remember at the time, Jack telling the story, and I had the tears running on my face, he kind of stepped back and he looked around the room and people began to clap and cheer because there was a plaque outside that had been given to him a week prior where the New York Times had named his church the largest church in the world. But that all started with not a pastor, but a lady named Miss Bethel who picked a kid up, put him on her knee, and told him that Jesus loved him more than all those kids with the fancy shoes. I will preach the gospel. Kendra will preach the gospel to your children. But we are not the Miss Bethel in that story. The Miss Bethel in that story is one of you sitting in this seat. She was not called to pastor. She was not called to preach. She was not called to anything other than to love small children and tell them Jesus loved them just as much, if not more, than the kids with the fancy shoes on. If you feel that conviction, that's not me. That's the Lord telling you that, man, he's got something for you. I need Miss Bethels at Kids Church. They're going to pick kids up, put them on their knees, and tell them the Lord loves them. And you won't know the ripple effects of, like myself, like Miss Kendra, who also grew up under his ministry. This man's name is Jack Hiles, who's long since passed away now. We'll be started with the seeds you plant in Kids Church. We have a meeting after church today of anyone that's interested in working in Kids Church, whether you currently do, whether you are thinking about something that's for you, and Kendra and I are going to share our little vision with you. It'll take 10 minutes. I would love for as many of you as possible to be part of that. Now, some of you say, I know my spot. I know I'm called to security. I'm called to the legacy team. I'm called this. If that's not your calling, I get you. I hear you. But if you felt like the Lord spoke to you then, I'd love for you to give us 10 minutes today. We kind of look through and we can talk about where possibly the Lord has openings for you in his life. The whole world's going to tell you that light's green, but we know it's red, folks. Stand strong in your resolve and your convictions that you